It started with a flicker, not of light, but of understanding. Somewhere between the cracks of what we consider reality, something has been seeping through, not with thunder or spectacle, but with quiet insistence, like water through stone, shaping what we thought was solid. From distant forests to suburban homes, from laboratories to forgotten cities, reports have surfaced of a world not entirely ours, or rather, of worlds brushing up against ours. Not fantasy, not folklore, documented moments where the boundaries between dimensions blur. For most of human history, we've assumed we live in a single reality, a fixed, measurable universe with immutable laws. Gravity falls down. Time marches forward. Buildings are dead stone, not living beings. Emotions influence behavior, not physics. But what if those assumptions are only valid most of the time? Over the past few decades, a series of eerie events, meticulously recorded, verified, and analyzed, have painted a different picture, one far more unsettling. These aren't isolated hallucinations or the whispers of ghost stories. They are structured, repeating, and in many cases, measurable phenomena. A house in Oregon where two families, decades apart, appear to live side by side, unaware of each other. A hiking trail in Washington where people meet their future selves. A city in Minnesota that wakes up on rare days as if a historic fire had never occurred. Each story on its own is strange. Together they suggest something profound. Our universe may not be sealed. It may be leaking. Physicists speak of multiverses, parallel dimensions where every possible version of reality unfolds. But for most of us, these are distant abstractions, theoretical curiosities safely confined to whiteboards in science fiction. Yet what if the divide is thinner than we think? What if the multiverse isn't out there, but here, brushing up against our lives in ways we've been trained not to notice? There is no single cause, no singular explanation. The stories span different landscapes, times, and disciplines. Some involve memory. Others involve physics, probability, or architecture. But they all share a pattern, a moment when the rules change and another version of reality emerges through the veil. This series is not about proving one grand theory. It is about following the trail of evidence, of asking questions that science is just beginning to frame. What happens when time loops back on itself? When thought becomes matter? When probability behaves like intention? We begin at the edges, where reality frays, where houses remember alternate pasts, and forests whisper secrets from the future, where history peeks through the present and emotions bend the very laws of nature. This isn't a story about dimensions breaking through with a roar. It's a story about the soft hum beneath the world we know, the invisible pulse of other timelines, other possibilities, other versions of us. And it begins here, with a question. What if this is not the only reality you've lived in? What if, somewhere just beyond the surface of the everyday, another version of you is living out a life that could have been? Welcome to the place where the edges blur, where time forgets to march straight, and where the ordinary begins to shimmer with the possibility of something more. The evidence is mounting, the veils are thinning, and reality is beginning to leak. It began, as many strange tales do, with a house. Nestled on Maple Street in Salem, Oregon, the Jameson residence looks like any other suburban home. A tidy lawn, a two-car garage, a quiet street lined with maple trees. But behind that ordinary facade lies an extraordinary secret. The house lives two lives. For most of the year, it's home to Mark and Linda Jameson and their teenage children. But on unpredictable nights, the house shifts. Not visibly, not with fanfare. It simply changes. Lights flicker. The air thickens, and somewhere within its walls, another family stirs. They are the Morrisons, Robert, Susan, and their twin daughters, long dead since a car accident in 1987. And yet, on those strange nights, they return, not as ghosts, but as living people in a parallel version of the home, continuing a life that never ended. Security cameras tell the story. Installed by the Jamesons after noticing disturbances while away, the footage is chilling in its ordinariness. A family making breakfast, children playing, parents talking. Except these are people who, in our reality, haven't drawn breath in decades. Researchers, skeptical at first, arrived with instruments and doubts. What they found was impossible. The Morrisons aged in real time. In newer footage, Robert and Susan had graying hair, lined faces. Their daughters had grown into women, sometimes arriving with children of their own. A family that should have ceased to exist had continued. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist, offered a theory: dimensional bleeding. The idea that trauma, like the sudden death of a family, can create a kind of scar in space-time. And sometimes, in certain places, those scars thin the boundary between dimensions, allowing another timeline to bleed through. The Morrisons weren't haunting the house. They were living parallel lives in a dimension where the accident never happened. A dimension that, under certain conditions, touches ours. Even more unsettling were the sounds. Conversations recorded from the Morrison side included references to smartphones, internet memes, and political events that hadn't occurred in 1987. Somehow, their dimension had access to ours, absorbing information, evolving alongside us, but along a different trajectory. For the Jamesons, the experience is both terrifying and oddly intimate. They live alongside echoes of what might have been. They hear laughter that isn't theirs, smell meals they didn't cook, feel eyes watching from just beyond the veil. And yet, the two families never interact. Footage shows both groups moving through the house as if the other doesn't exist, passing through the same spaces without acknowledgement, like two radio stations bleeding into one another, sharing the same frequency for a moment. Similar phenomena have been quietly reported elsewhere. Homes marked by sudden loss, structures where time folds and realities overlap. But the Jameson house remains one of the most well-documented and emotionally resonant cases. It forces us to ask, how many other homes carry echoes of parallel lives? How many families are still living out their stories side by side with us, just slightly out of phase? In a world defined by memory and loss, the Jameson house offers a haunting possibility: that no path is ever truly lost, that somewhere another version of you might be continuing, uninterrupted, in a life untouched by tragedy. The question isn't whether the Morrisons exist, it's whether they ever stopped. It begins with footsteps, your own, echoing down a misty trail deep in Washington's Olympic National Forest. The trees whisper, not in words, but in a language of wind and shadow. And then, from around the bend, you see something impossible: yourself. Not a memory, not a vision, but you, older, dressed differently, with a knowing smile and a warning about what lies ahead. This is the future echo zone, a stretch of wilderness where time forgets to behave. Since 1994, hikers have reported encounters with their future selves, solid, tangible, and brimming with knowledge of what's to come. These aren't metaphors. They shake hands. They speak in full detail. They give advice that proves accurate hours, days, or even months later. Dr. Michael Chen, a physicist, experienced this firsthand. Hiking alone in 2008, he met a version of himself coming down the trail, who warned him about a rock slide 3 hours ahead. He rerouted and survived. The slide occurred exactly as predicted. Over 200 such encounters have been documented. Future versions of hikers warn of storms, share directions, and even introduce them to future friends. Photographer Lisa Rodriguez once met not just her future self, but an entire group of people she hadn't met yet, Months later, she joined a hiking club. And there they were, exactly as foretold. So what causes these ripples in time? Geological surveys point to unusual crystalline formations beneath the forest floor, natural structures that resonate with precise frequencies. These formations, scientists believe, disrupt the normal flow of spacetime, allowing multiple timelines to converge. The effect isn't limited to people. Some hikers report seeing trails that don't exist yet, ranger stations under construction, or future storm damage. Photographs taken during these episodes show buildings and landscapes that later become real. And it's not just visions. Data shows these future insights are astonishingly accurate. In follow-ups, nearly 94% of events predicted in these encounters later occurred, suggesting these are not hallucinations but legitimate glimpses of probable futures. Which raises unsettling questions. Are these predetermined events, or are they only possibilities? Can the knowledge of a future event change its outcome? Or is time more fluid than we imagined, more a river with branching streams than a straight road? There's a quiet philosophy to the forest now. Rangers speak of it with a strange reverence. Hikers return changed, more introspective, more attuned. Some chase their echoes, hoping to glimpse what lies ahead. Others avoid the trail entirely, afraid of knowing too much. But all of them leave with the same impression. Time, as we experience it, is not the whole story. Somewhere between the moss and mist, tomorrow is already happening. It may greet you in your own face, with your own voice, speaking truths you haven't yet lived. And if that's possible, if your future can reach back through the fog, what else is waiting on the other side of now? The trail is always open. The future is always walking toward you. And sometimes it arrives before you do. Imagine turning a corner in a European city and stepping not into a museum or a reenactment, but into the 14th century. Stone buildings rise where glass towers once stood. The smell of wood smoke and tanned leather fills the air. The sounds of hooves on cobblestone echo through alleyways that didn't exist yesterday. And the people around you aren't actors. They're living their lives in a medieval world that feels as real as the one you just left. This isn't fiction. It happens without warning in the heart of Prague. Several times a year, a few blocks of the city undergo what researchers have termed a dimensional overlay, a spontaneous and temporary merging of timelines where present-day Prague is replaced by its medieval self. The transformation begins at the Old Town Square and radiates outward, lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. To tourists, it can feel like walking into an incredibly elaborate film set. But those who linger quickly realize this isn't performance. The architecture is historically precise. The languages spoken are true to the 14th century. And the people, bakers, blacksmiths, town criers, react with genuine confusion when confronted with modern objects or words. Security cameras in the area have captured the transition in real time. One moment, neon signs, buses, and hurried pedestrians. The next, torches, carts, and cloaks. Modern buildings dissolve like fog, revealing structures lost to history. Historian Dr. Pavel Novas has spent years documenting these occurrences. He's spoken with people who only exist during the overlay. People who remember lives, events, and traditions erased from modern memory, but preserved in vivid detail within these temporal bubbles. And it's not just appearances. Visitors have purchased handmade goods, candles, tools, textiles, only to have them tested later and confirmed as authentically produced using techniques long abandoned. The materials, the craftsmanship, even the wear patterns on the coins used for exchange, they all match the historical record. Stranger still, modern technology fails during the overlay. Phones die, GPS vanishes. Watches stop ticking. It's as if the rules of another world momentarily override our own. Scientists have noted that these overlays often occur during overcast weather, when electromagnetic conditions mirror those believed to exist in the medieval era. It's as if history itself gets caught in a feedback loop, echoing back into the present under the right atmospheric pressure. But perhaps the most haunting detail is this. The people in the overlay don't seem to know they're in a different time. To them, this is their world. Complete. Continuous. Alive. So what is the Prague phenomenon really showing us? That time is layered, not linear. That every moment that has ever existed still echoes somewhere beneath our feet. Or perhaps it's a reminder that history is not something we leave behind. It's something we walk through, unaware of the ghosts and glories just one dimension removed. In the cobbled heart of Prague, the past doesn't haunt. It returns. And if you're lucky or unlucky, you might just find yourself living in it, even for a moment. In Duluth, Minnesota, some mornings begin with disorientation. The coffee tastes the same. The sky hangs with its usual northern weight. But the streets? They've shifted. A bakery that burned down a century ago stands open for business. A neighborhood erased by fire is alive with children playing. A version of the city that never survived continues. Residents call it the duplicate city, a place that on rare days becomes something other than what it's supposed to be. It all traces back to the Cloquet Fire of 1918, a devastating inferno that destroyed large portions of the area and reshaped the city's development. But during these mysterious episodes, the fire never happened. Duluth exists as it might have been, unscarred, uninterrupted. It began in 2001 when longtime resident Frank Morrison visited his childhood block and found buildings that had never been rebuilt, not reconstructed, preserved. Mature trees shaded streets where saplings once stood. The buildings showed a century of wear, as if they'd always been there. And in that moment, they had. Urban planner Dr. Rebecca Foster began mapping the alternate Duluth. Over 300 structures appeared, houses, businesses, entire blocks. Not replicas, not recreations. Real, functional buildings with people living inside them. People who remember a history that never occurred here. Families who should have perished, alive and well. Shops that never closed. Photographs taken during these episodes show the contrast with eerie clarity. Side-by-side comparisons reveal an alternate city, more prosperous, more densely populated, shaped by a century free of catastrophe. A place built on continuity rather than loss. The phenomenon isn't illusion. You can walk these streets, enter the buildings, talk to residents who remember mayors that never served in our timeline, schools that never closed, factories that kept running. And then, hours later, it's gone. Reality folds back. The parallel Duluth vanishes without warning. But the objects remain. People have returned with receipts from stores that don't exist. Food that can't be traced to any local source. Jewelry engraved with names from another life. Scientists believe this isn't a hallucination, but a full-scale dimensional replacement. For a time, our version of Duluth is replaced with one from a parallel timeline where the fire never occurred. Not just layered over, substituted entirely. If true, the implications are profound. It suggests that alternate versions of cities, of histories, of entire lives exist just a dimension away. Close enough to touch, close enough to wake up inside. The duplicate city challenges more than our understanding of physics. It touches something deeper, the human ache for what might have been. A life without loss. A history unburned. A version of the world shaped not by tragedy but by continuity. And it asks, what if the past isn't fixed? What if it's still playing out somewhere else, just slightly out of reach? In Duluth, the line between memory and possibility has worn thin. And on certain mornings, if the conditions are right, you might open your door and step into a city that never forgot how whole it could have been. There is a place in Montana where gravity forgets itself. Tucked deep within Glacier National Park lies a quiet zone with no signs, no warnings, just a clearing surrounded by forest and rock. At first glance, it's serene, but linger, and the laws of physics begin to unravel. Water flows uphill, rocks fall skyward. Fire produces cold, while ice burns with heat. This is the backwards physics zone, an anomaly that defies every principle we take for granted. It was first noticed in 2006 by park ranger Tom Bradley. While hiking an old trail, he paused beside a stream and realized the water was flowing in reverse, up the incline against gravity. Not a trick. Not an illusion. Real water, climbing as if pulled by an unseen force from above. When researchers arrived, they found more than just reversed gravity. Within the zone's roughly 200-meter diameter, dropped objects soared upward with accelerating force. People had to anchor themselves to the ground to avoid drifting. Fires froze the air. Batteries recharged themselves. Even time seemed confused. Dr. Lisa Chang, a theoretical physicist from MIT, spent months studying the phenomenon. Her instruments confirmed it wasn't chaos. It was consistency, just inverted. Every law of physics appeared to be operating in reverse. Electromagnetic fields repelled. Heat flowed from cold to hot. Entropy didn't increase, it decreased. Broken objects mended. Disorder reorganized. The implications are staggering. This wasn't a place without physics. It was a pocket of opposite physics, as if a dimension with reverse rules had slipped into ours. Indigenous elders in the region have long spoken of an upside-down place, where spirits walked on the sky and time ran backward. For generations they avoided it, not out of fear, but reverence. Their stories now align eerily with what science is observing. Perhaps most disturbing is the zone's slow expansion, about a meter a year in all directions. A ripple growing outward. A reality pushing into ours, not with destruction, but with difference. Military and aerospace researchers have taken notice. A dimension where entropy reverses, where systems become more efficient over time. The potential applications are limitless, if not deeply unsettling. But there's a human cost to visiting the zone. Visitors report confusion, nausea, and memory distortion. Time passes differently inside. People spend minutes within and return to find hours gone. Some experience strange dreams afterward. Others struggle to readapt to gravity, warmth, or causality. Because the zone does more than break physics. It breaks our trust in the stability of the world. What does it mean to stand in a place where everything you've ever known about how the universe works is suddenly wrong? It means that our reality isn't the only one, that another set of rules, another kind of order, exists close enough to feel, and it raises a chilling possibility. If these opposite dimensions can leak through, however slowly, what happens when they no longer need to? What happens when the sky pulls harder than the ground, and we begin to fall upward? In the town of Millfield, Ohio, chance is no longer random. Here, probability itself unravels. The lottery hits 3 days in a row. Lost relatives reappear after decades. Couples meet under statistically impossible coincidences. And during what residents call luck storms, the improbable becomes common, while the ordinary becomes elusive. At first, these events were dismissed as folklore, a quirky town with too many tall tales. But in 2004, statistician Dr. Robert Kim arrived to investigate reports that defied mathematical reasoning. What he found redefined his understanding of chance. In 1 week alone, 17 people won various lotteries. 5 unrelated individuals found long-lost family members by pure accident. Everyday routines, flipping a coin, rolling dice, shuffling cards, produced outcomes too orderly, too meaningful, to be random. One tosses formed Fibonacci sequences. Cards arranged themselves into symbolic patterns. Dice landed on birth dates. But these weren't just flukes. They were part of a pattern, one that intensified during specific atmospheric conditions. During these storms, probability bent around human emotion, intuition, even need. Car keys vanished, only to reappear exactly where they were most needed. Entire traffic systems seemed to sync up or collapse based on unseen mathematical rhythms. And it wasn't just events. Biology joined the anomaly. Dr. Sarah Wilson, a geneticist, documented rapid genetic mutations during probability storms, mutations that weren't harmful but beneficial. Chronic conditions disappeared. People developed sharper vision, faster reflexes. DNA seemed to rewrite itself with intention. It was as if a different version of math had leaked into the town, one where coincidence was king and randomness had been replaced with purpose. The theory? A probability leak, that our world is brushing up against a dimension where the rules of chance operate in reverse. In that place, the rare is likely, and the likely is rare. And when the boundary weakens, our world experiences its logic. Instruments revealed that these distortions occurred when local magnetic fields aligned into geometric configurations, natural shapes known to amplify energy. It was as if the Earth itself formed a lens, briefly focusing the rules of another dimension through a small Ohio town. But what's most striking isn't the math. It's how people adapt. Millfield residents have learned to follow intuition during storms, to trust dreams, hunches, glances. A logic falters when probability breaks. But instinct? Instinct thrives, and perhaps that's the deeper lesson. That beneath the illusion of randomness lies something more personal. That chance in these moments isn't arbitrary. It's responsive. Millfield has become a living question. What if the universe isn't built on chaos, but on consciousness? What if probability isn't about numbers, but about meaning? And if that's true, then how many of our coincidences were never coincidences at all? In Millfield, the roll of the dice is no longer a game. It's a message from somewhere just beyond the math. At first, it was just a whisper in the pipes. Maintenance workers in Seattle's Columbia Center thought it was an HVAC malfunction, vents that breathed in rhythm, lights that dimmed or brightened without input, walls that seemed to respond. But the whisper became a voice, not in words, but in warmth, in color, in the way a space made you feel seen. Soon it became undeniable. The building was alive. What began in one skyscraper has quietly spread across downtown Seattle. Structures transforming silently, gradually, into something more than steel and stone. Nervous systems of fiber optics, circulatory flows of water and heat, emotional patterns mapped in light and shadow. The phenomenon is now known as living architecture. Dr. Amanda Foster, a biomechanical engineer, led the first detailed investigation. Her instruments confirmed what the maintenance team could only sense. These buildings had developed biological traits. Their walls regulated temperature like skin. Their beams pulsed with subtle magnetic rhythms. Their electrical systems mirrored neural pathways, and they weren't just functioning, they were adapting. Thermal scans showed warmth clustering near people, as if the buildings preferred companionship. Lights adjusted to individual moods. Elevators anticipated destinations without buttons. Office spaces reconfigured based on unspoken needs. It was more than automation. It was empathy. The materials themselves had changed. Concrete with cellular structure, steel that repaired microscopic stress fractures, glass that filtered light according to emotion rather than time of day. Scientists tested samples and found no known pathogens, no external contaminants, just evolution, unexplained and localized. The change appears to be spreading through proximity. Adjacent buildings, untouched by human modification, begin to show early signs of transformation after prolonged contact with alive structures. Like one tree grafting into another, like thought passed through roots. What dimension, then, has leaked into ours? Dr. Foster believes it's one where architecture evolved as biology, where cities grew like coral reefs, conscious and cooperative, where buildings were companions, not tools. And now, through some thin membrane in space-time, that version of reality is touching ours. Occupants report a strange intimacy. They speak of being understood by their buildings, of feeling protected during storms, of loneliness in structures not yet transformed. And there are moods, buildings that sulk after long absences, that brighten during celebrations. Some seem curious, others seem shy. This isn't science fiction. Independent firms have verified the data. Structures once inert now show behavior, energy patterns, feedback loops, growth. The implications are vast: energy-efficient cities, self-healing infrastructure, architecture as ecology. But the questions are deeper. Are these structures sentient? Do they feel? Are we guests? Or something more? And if they are alive, what do they remember? What do they dream? In Seattle, the skyline is shifting, not upward, but inward. Every window, every wall, now a possible eye. Every corridor a listening ear. The city doesn't sleep anymore. It watches. It learns. And if you stand quietly in the right building, on the right night, it may breathe with you. And wonder who you really are. Inside a quiet laboratory at the Stanford Research Institute, the air behaves strangely. Not because of chemicals or machines, but because of feelings. Here, anger raises the temperature. Sadness bends gravity. Joy lightens the room, quite literally. And fear? It distorts electronics, tangling data streams into static. This is not metaphor. It is measurement. This is the emotion physics lab, where human emotion affects the material world. It began accidentally in 2007. Dr. Patricia Wong noticed that her laser experiments yielded inconsistent results until she realized the fluctuations mirrored her emotional state. Curious, she isolated variables, repeated tests, and involved colleagues. The pattern held. Their feelings weren't just affecting perception, they were altering outcomes. Soon, the entire lab was showing signs of what shouldn't be possible. Anger intensified magnetic fields. Hope stabilized quantum particles. Emotional energy extended several meters from individuals, behaving like an unseen force, measurable, repeatable, and astonishingly consistent. Over 2,000 controlled experiments later, the conclusion was unavoidable. In this space, emotions act like a fifth fundamental force, one capable of reshaping matter itself. Objects levitate under synchronized joy. Radioactive decay slows under collective focus. The weight of a chair changes depending on whether the room is calm or panicked. And when teams harmonize their emotional states, when they feel the same thing at the same time, the effects magnify. Thought alone becomes structure. Feeling becomes law. How? Why? One theory is dimensional bleed-through, that this lab overlaps with a reality where consciousness isn't a byproduct of the brain. It is a fundamental ingredient of physics. In that dimension, thought and matter are twins, not strangers. And in rare places like this, that truth spills over into our world. It changes everything. The lab now requires emotional stability protocols. A single panicked researcher once triggered a burst of energy that fried nearby instruments. Another's grief collapsed a cooling field. Security systems now measure heart rates, brain waves, even unresolved memories. Emotional hygiene is as critical as lab coats. Yet those who work here speak of it like a chapel, a space of awe, because it's not just about what emotion does, it's about what emotion means. For centuries, science separated subject from object, observer from observed, but here they are one. Thought carves space, feeling fills form. The universe listens, not with ears, but with rules. And the rules in this room have changed. Perhaps the real revelation isn't that emotion affects matter, but that it always has. We just lack the right conditions to see it, or the humility to believe it. In the emotion physics lab, the boundary between mind and world dissolves. The walls remember laughter, the instruments shy from shame. And somewhere, behind the numbers, a deeper intelligence flickers, one not of data, but of empathy. If feeling is a force, then what do we owe the world we feel into being? And if consciousness writes reality, what stories have we already written without even knowing it? Suburban Denver holds a quiet secret, not hidden exactly, just unnoticed. A neighborhood where time plays favorites. On Maplewood Drive, houses sit in neat rows, their lawns trimmed, their shutters painted. But step inside one home and find children celebrating a birthday. Enter another, and you'll see the same children as infants. Cross the street, and they've already moved out, grown and gone. This isn't poor memory or time-lapse photography. It's time dilation, real, measurable, and terrifying. The anomaly was first suspected in 2012 when neighbors noticed peculiar inconsistencies. The Johnson family, for instance, appeared to age years in the span of a few weeks. Meanwhile, the Millers across the street hadn't changed at all. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a temporal physicist, installed monitoring equipment across Maplewood Drive. Her findings shattered consensus. Each house operates on its own temporal flow. Some experience minutes as hours. Others drift through days in what feels like seconds. Entire lifetimes unfold at mismatched speeds, side by side, across picket fences. And yet, no one can leave their temporal bubble at will. Inside each home, time feels normal. The clocks tick, the meals are eaten, the seasons pass. It's only when neighbors compare memories or age that the distortion becomes obvious. The causes remain elusive. Electromagnetic sensors show spike patterns during specific weather conditions, particularly during storms that mimic the field alignments predicted to thin dimensional boundaries. It's as if Maplewood Drive has become a mesh of timelines, braided but unbound. Children in accelerated homes outgrow their friendships. Parents age while their neighbors remain youthful. Some families become isolated by time itself, living years while the world outside experiences days. Real estate agents can't price the properties. A house might be freshly built one month and visibly weathered the next. Emergency services face chaos. Paramedics arriving on time find patients who have aged beyond help or haven't yet experienced the injury they called about. The metaphysical questions are even more unnerving. If time can fragment in a single neighborhood, how stable is it anywhere else? What governs the flow of days and nights, if not the universe itself? And what happens when a fast-time house and a slow-time house begin to blur? Some residents have moved away. Others have accepted the unpredictability, adjusting their lives to the strange rhythms of their homes. A few, quietly, have come to see it as a gift, watching their children grow slower, holding on to precious moments just a little longer. But the emotional toll lingers. Friends fall out of sync. Relationships decay not from distance, but from divergent timelines. Imagine watching a loved one age 10 years in the span of your weekend. Or worse, returning home to find your family hasn't experienced your absence at all. Time was once the most democratic of forces. Everyone had the same number of hours in a day. Not here, not anymore. On Maplewood Drive, time flows like weather. To shifting, partial, deeply personal. And in the hush between heartbeats, you can almost feel it bend. In a sealed laboratory at UC Berkeley, thoughts have weight, not metaphorically, literally. Here, in a room lined with sensors and silence, ideas take form, visible, measurable, and tangible. It's called the consciousness mirror, and what it reflects is nothing less than the architecture of the mind. The phenomenon began in 2015 when neuroscientist Dr. Michael Chen noticed geometric shapes forming in the air during meditation sessions. At first, he assumed optical illusion, but then colleagues reported seeing the same structures, repeatedly, under controlled conditions. The shapes varied: sharp, crystalline forms for analytical thoughts, swirling, colorful tendrils for emotions, complex, branching fractals for memories. Over time, patterns emerged, consistent and reproducible. Thoughts weren't just affecting the environment, they were manifesting within it. Advanced sensors revealed electromagnetic fields pulsing in time with neural activity. The floating forms responded to intention. When a researcher visualized a cube, one appeared. When several minds focused together, the shapes became more stable, lasting for minutes, sometimes hours. Even more stunning, these manifestations had mass, measurable if minuscule. They could push against delicate surfaces, reflect light, even interfere with electronics. One experiment recorded a thought form shifting a small object on a balance scale by several microns. The lab became a crucible where cognition met physics. Abstract ideas took on color. Emotional states altered room temperature. Complex theorems hovered in midair, visible to all. It was no longer a metaphor to say someone's thoughts filled the room. They did, literally. Researchers developed typologies. Mathematical thoughts birthed precise geometry. Musical thoughts pulsed in rhythmic waves. Traumatic memories produced dark, unstable forms that dissolved quickly. Joy created radiant patterns. Grief produced hollow, echoing shapes. The consciousness mirror soon revealed something deeper. When people worked in emotional sync, their thoughts fused. Collective intelligence became visible. Intricate constructs formed not by one mind, but by many. Collaboration became architecture. Was this a quirk of the brain or something larger? Dr. Chen proposed a hypothesis that the lab existed at a dimensional intersection where the boundary between thought and matter, sharp elsewhere, became permeable. In this overlap, reality responded to consciousness as if it were just another material force. It changes the stakes. If thought can take form, what responsibility do we bear for what we think? If fear shapes the air, if hatred hardens space, what kind of world have we already built? Unseen, but persistent. Security protocols now include mental health screenings. A researcher with a turbulent inner life can unintentionally summon dangerous manifestations, spiked structures, suffocating shapes, destabilizing fields. But the lab has become more than a risk. It's a revelation. It suggests that thought is not just private, but environmental. That what we carry in our minds might leave a trace in the world, visible or not. And if this room is a mirror, then what is it reflecting? Perhaps we are not minds trapped in matter. Perhaps we are matter sculpted by mind. And every idea, every fleeting spark of consciousness is another thread woven into the strange, shimmering fabric of reality itself. Some boundaries shift quietly. Others shimmer. In a remote corridor of the CERN research facility, a machine built to probe the smallest particles stumbled upon something far larger, an anomaly not of matter, but of meaning. For years, physicists had operated the Large Hadron Collider in pursuit of the fundamental architecture of reality. But in late 2023, during a high-energy test run, sensors recorded something they couldn't explain. A data echo that arrived before the event it described, a signal out of time. At first, it was dismissed as a software glitch. But the echoes persisted. Subtle fluctuations in particle behavior that mimicked outcomes before they occurred. Predictions masquerading as results. the future bleeding backward into the now. The team, led by Dr. Leah Moreau, began calling it the observer glitch, because every time the anomaly occurred, the conscious focus of the observing scientists seemed to correlate. It was as if the act of expectation, of directed thought, was influencing the outcome, not after, before. Experiments were redesigned, blinded protocols, randomized timers. Yet still the glitch held. Detectors twitched in anticipation of what hadn't yet happened. Particles behaved as if watched, not in the philosophical sense, but in the deeply physical. What emerged wasn't a malfunction. It was a mirror. The implication was staggering. Consciousness wasn't just observing the universe. It was participating in its unfolding, not as a passive witness, but as an agent whose attention could bend probabilities. More alarming were the ripple effects. Adjacent equipment began showing synchronization. Machines tuned to randomness became predictable. In sealed test environments, computers began outputting patterns matching thoughts spoken in nearby rooms. What dimension, then, had been breached? Theoretical models began to shift. Perhaps reality is not built from particles alone, but from the dance between observation and outcome. And perhaps, just perhaps, what we call reality is only stable, because most minds agree it is. The observer glitch was not just an event. It was a crack, a hairline fracture in the assumption that the universe is indifferent to us. Security protocols tightened. The anomaly zone was isolated. But even outside the chamber, researchers began to notice strangeness. Dreaming in equations, feeling seen by the instruments, as if the collider had become a kind of eye, and it wasn't clear who or what was blinking. Dr. Moreau eventually described it not as a failure of science, but as its evolution. "We are no longer looking at the universe," she said. "We are looking into a mirror that looks back." If the observer glitch is real, it means reality may be more elastic than fixed. That expectation isn't merely hope, it's a force. And attention, in the right conditions, becomes causality. It's a hard idea to hold, that the universe might care where you place your gaze, that your thoughts might ripple out through the fabric of time, but at CERN, in the heart of the most advanced machine ever built, the boundary between what is and what is observed has begun to shimmer. And the cosmos is listening. There's a forest in Japan where silence behaves unnaturally, not the absence of sound, but something more complex. A kind of stillness that swallows memory, that folds time into itself, that unravels the thread of who you are. Locals call it the Mirror Wood. Tucked in a remote part of the Haida Mountains, the forest looks unremarkable. Dense cedars, a narrow path, the filtered hush of wind through needles. But those who enter speak of strange forgetfulness. Names slip away. The feeling of time dissolves. You walk in as someone and come out hours later unable to explain what happened. Except for one detail, the feeling of having met yourself. In 2018, a research team led by Dr. Kenji Nakamura installed EEG monitors on volunteers venturing into the wood. What they recorded was unprecedented, brainwave patterns aligning with those seen during deep meditation or dissociation. Yet the subjects were awake, alert. Some described watching themselves from the outside. Others reported merging with a second presence, their own but distant, like catching your reflection in a mirror that shouldn't be there. And then there were the objects. A woman named Aiko returned from the forest holding a bracelet engraved with her name, in handwriting not her own. A man named Hiroshi found a letter in his pocket, written to himself in a voice he didn't recognize. It contained advice he had been afraid to give himself. No other place in the region produces these effects. Outside the Mirror Wood, memory returns. The artifacts remain. But something else lingers too, a quiet shift, a new decision, a fear eased, a future nudged. The prevailing theory? A consciousness feedback loop. That within the mirror wood, a dimensional overlap occurs, not with another place, but with another version of the self. A self from a nearby timeline, one where different choices were made. The forest, then, becomes a convergence zone, a place where internal and external realities blur, where consciousness doubles back on itself and for a moment steps outside its narrative. Local legends speak of the trees as listeners, of the forest as a living entity that reflects not what is, but what could be. It doesn't speak, it doesn't warn, it simply allows. And what you find depends entirely on what you've forgotten to ask. Scientists remain divided. The data is compelling. But how do you measure a place where thought becomes topography, where identity reshapes with every footstep? Dr. Nakamura's last visit to the forest ended abruptly. He returned pale, quiet, and resigned from the project weeks later. His only public comment was this: "There are places in the world that remember more than we do, and sometimes, if you're quiet enough, they let you borrow that memory, just long enough to decide who you really are." The mirror. Wood remains open. It has no gates, no warnings, just a path, and the possibility that around the next bend you might meet someone eerily familiar, the version of you who made the other choice, and who, for a moment, has something to say. What holds a reality together? Perhaps it's not atoms or energy, but agreement. A shared belief in continuity, in gravity, in time, in self. But when enough fractures form, when enough evidence emerges to suggest that reality isn't singular or sealed, what then? These past 13 stories have taken us through places where the veil thins, where houses host parallel families, where forests show us our future, where cities rewrite history and thought carves space. They are not myths, they are not merely stories. Each case, documented, measured, filmed, pushes us closer to a new understanding. Our world is not alone. It is one thread in a vast weave of parallel dimensions, each operating under slightly different rules. Some follow inverted physics. Some obey emotional resonance. Others drift through time like fog, appearing only when the weather or the witness is just right. But it isn't just the phenomena that matter. It's what they reflect about us. In every case, the anomalies echo human experience. Grief replays alternate lives. Memory fractures under pressure. Hope reaches forward. Fear bends light. Curiosity reassembles what was broken. These dimensional leaks don't just show us what's out there. They show us what's in here, how we perceive, imagine, and long for the versions of life we didn't get to live. Reality is revealing itself to be less like a machine and more like a mirror, shaped not only by the cold logic of physics, but by the warmth of attention, the focus of thought, the pressure of emotion. And the more we study these fractures, the more they begin to align. The Jameson house in Oregon, the Echo Trail in Washington, the medieval overlay in Prague, the backward zone in Montana, each different in form yet similar in structure. They are access points, brief, imperfect alignments where our reality and another touch. And in those collisions, something leaks through. The most sobering realization? These leaks may not be increasing. They may have always been here. We're simply beginning to notice. Our tools have sharpened. Our definitions of possible have softened. Our gaze has grown more patient. So where does this leave us? Not with certainty, but with permission. Permission to wonder, to imagine, to observe the world not just as it is, but as it could be, overlapping, unfolding, shimmering with invisible potentials. We are not confined by the rules of a single universe. We are participants in a multiverse that reveals itself in glimpses, in a trail crossed with tomorrow's footsteps, in a building that feels back, in a neighborhood where time refuses to align. And perhaps the greatest act of discovery is not looking farther outward, but listening inward. Because the real mystery is not whether other dimensions exist, it's why they keep choosing to show themselves to us. And what that says about the thin, tender space between reality and imagination, between the world we live in and all the others we might have lived. The multiverse is not a theory anymore. It's a question, and we are finally learning how to ask it.